You're watching a special edition of Small Business Network, How to Manage Your PPP Loan.
Montgomery Community Media presents Small Business Network, brought to you by Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. SBN is also sponsored by M&T Bank and Leadership Montgomery.
Hello and welcome to Montgomery Community Media's Small Business Network. I'm your host, Kelly Leonard. Thank you for joining us for this special at-home edition. Joining us online to discuss managing your PPP loan are Barbara Cromer, CPA and shareholder at Snyder Cone PC, Jared Ricks, who is the Vice President and Business Banking Team Leader at M&T Bank, and Andrew Schwartz, Principal at Stein Sperling Bennett DeJong Driscoll PC. Welcome, everybody, and let's jump right into our topic. First up, Jared. We're hearing a lot about PPP loan forgiveness in recent weeks. I'm just curious to know, what are the costs? What costs are eligible for PPP forgiveness?
Kelly, no, that's a great question. So eligible costs are actually one of the items that have changed under the passing of the Flexibility Act that came out on June 5th. So at a minimum, 60% of the loan proceeds need to be used for payroll expenses. That's a change from the original 75%. So that includes health and retirement benefits, as well as any payments of state and local taxes. 40% of the usage can be used for eligible business expenses, which is also a change from the initial 25%. So any business mortgage interest, business rent and lease payments, as well as any business utility payments. Now, keep in mind, these expenses needed to have been in effect prior to February 15th of this year.
Well, okay, so it sounds like it's a pretty extensive list, and I'm sure reporting and all those things are really important. So are there any tips or things that you can share with folks who are listening in terms of just making sure that they have the proper records and preparation for this process?
Yeah, good question. So I think, at a minimum, you want to document. First and foremost, I think information on your FTE or full-time equivalent employees is pertinent. Their names, last four digits of their social security numbers, as well as breakouts of employees that are making over and under $100,000 in annual income. And then also a big pain point that we're hearing right now in the business community is the loss of employees or challenges with bringing folks back. You want to make sure that you're documenting those outreach efforts as well, making good faith written offers to rehire them, making sure that they have the same salary and wages prior to separation, and making sure you're also documenting and keeping records of the rejection for those employees that come back. But at a minimum, make sure you're keeping close with your tax professional and your banker, and making sure you're documenting as much as possible.
Great. Now, on that note, since you mentioned your tax professional, and we have Barbara here with us. Barbara, one of the things that I think there's a lot of confusion swirling around, I've heard that forgiven PPP funds are taxable, then you hear that they're not. So, what's the story behind what's true and what is false?
Really good question. So when Congress initially passed the PPP, they specifically put in there that these loans, when they are forgiven, are not taxable. But what didn't get taken into consideration is that there's a provision within the tax code that says that any expenses that are paid for using non-taxable revenue are non-deductible expenses. So if you don't have to report the forgiveness as income, but you also can't deduct the expenses based on that you've used that income to pay for. So it almost, in essence, works out as if the funds are taxable. So you end up on the same place from a bottom line perspective on your tax return as if the funds were taxable. So that's, I think, why a lot of people are saying, it really is taxable. It's because of the non-deductibility of expenses. So that actually leads into a really interesting strategic thing. So one of the things that you can pay for with the PPP funds is retirement contributions. So one of the questions I've been getting from my clients a lot is, can I use that to pay for the match that I'm making or my profit sharing contribution that I'm making right now for last year, because it's very common for companies to pay the prior year contribution in that kind of March to July timeframe. So it's an interesting question. And as the various acts and guidance have come out that have kind of loosened what you can use the PPP funds for, i.e. whether incurred and paid were together or whether it was paid during this period and incurred. And it's become a lot looser as more guidance has come out. So theoretically, could you use those funds to pay for last year's contribution that you always pay during this time frame? Theoretically, yes. But you probably did your tax planning last year assuming that that contribution was going to be deductible on 2019. So there are all kinds of potential foot faults here that people need to be aware of.
Wow. Well, I know, and it's a constantly moving target. I think, Barbara, as you and I were mentioning just leading into this conversation, is the fact that depending on the day of the week, the rules are constantly changing. And so now more than ever, I think it's so critically important for us as the business community to have a strong banking relationship, an attorney, a CPA. And so, I'm definitely excited that we're having this conversation today. So another thing, so Jared, we also hear about the covered periods. So what are the covered periods under the loan forgiveness guidelines, and how long should customers expect maturity dates to run for funds that aren't forgiven?
Really, really great question and a really important topic. So, the cover period is essentially 8 weeks or your 24-week period beginning from when your loan was dispersed to you. Now, there is an alternative payroll cover period as well, which is 8 weeks or 24-week period based on the first pay period following the loan disbursement. One of the big changes that occurred also on June 5th was that the maturity date for any unforgiven portion of the PPP funds was extended from 2 years out to 5 years. Now, there's an important thing to note. Any PPP loan originated prior to the enactment of the Flexibility Act on June 5th. The Flexibility Act permits, but it does not require that a borrower and the lender, modify the terms of the PPP to provide the extended maturity. So again, great communication between you and your financial institution that you receive your PPP funds for. Make sure you check back with them to see if you're going to be able to extend beyond the 2 years up to the 5 years if you got your loan prior to June 5th.
So now you mentioned two particular periods, so 8 week, 24-week period. And again, most business owners are like, oh my goodness, all of this is like so very overwhelming and confusing to me. So Barbara, how do I choose? How do I choose? Is it between the 8 weeks, the 24-week period? What's the best practice around that?
Okay, another great question. So I want to throw in that you alluded to it just before at the end of my prior comment. We are taping this as of June 26th, so everything that we're saying is true as of right now. Can't tell you that there's not an SBA interim final rule that's being released as we speak that could change something. So it's really important that anybody who is watching this, whether it's live or on one of the accessing it later on, that you verify and look to see what additional guidance has come out beyond this date that could change anything that we're saying. So for the original PPP that was issued back at the end of March, that allowed only an 8-week covered period. When the Flexibility Act was passed in early June, then that changed the period to 24 weeks. And for anyone who got their loan prior to June 5th, they can pick whether they use the 8-week period or the 24-week period. So what most people are finding is that if you truly have used all of your funds for eligible costs during that 8-week covered period, you haven't had a reduction in full-time equivalent headcount, you haven't had a reduction in salaries more than 25% that you're paying to your employees. If you are really confident that you have met all those criteria, that you've appropriately spent all the funds on eligible costs, then it probably makes sense to choose that 8-week period, because then you've got the certainty of knowing that you've put this behind you, you've adequately spent it, you've submitted the forgiveness application, your bank has evaluated it and said, yeah, it's good. SBA looks and says the same thing. You're forgiven. And then it's like, oh, okay, that's taken care of. I don't have to worry about that. I've got some certainty as I approach year-end tax planning and all those kind of things. That being said, if you have not been able to spend your money on eligible costs during that time frame, then it makes a lot more sense, obviously, to go with the 24-week period, because the goal here is for everyone to hopefully achieve full forgiveness. And as the Flexibility Act came out, and then the additional interim final rules and some FAQs that have come out since then, it seems to be the requirements. So they're making it easier for people to find ways, with various safe harbors and exceptions that have been put in place. They're making it much easier for the business owner to find ways of achieving as close to full forgiveness of this as possible. So if you can do it with the 8-week, I'd recommend doing it with the 8-week for the certainty. Otherwise, go with the 24-week, so that, again, the goal is to achieve full forgiveness.
Gotcha. Now, Andrew, I know we're having a lot of fun over here with Barbara and Jared, but I want to invite your voice into this conversation and really switch gears a little bit and really focus on the human capital element of, just everything that's going on with PPP and COVID. And as we, as jurisdictions, begin to really slowly reopening, I'd imagine a key consideration for many organizations is when and how to bring their teams back and do it in such a way where it ensures everyone's safety. What are some of the safeguards that employers should be considering as they're beginning to slowly reopening? So safeguards not only for their teams, but also for the perhaps community or customers that they might be serving as well.
Right. That's a great point, Kelly, and thanks for having me on the show today. As employers start to return to work, depending on the jurisdiction in which they're located, it's important that the employer balances the health and safety of its employees while also maintaining its operations. And so there's going to be understandably a lot of people that are fearful of returning back to the office during these times. And it can be important that the employer, works with its employees and staff and even customers to alleviate those concerns. And one of the most important things to do for the employees is to potentially reevaluate and configure the offices. That includes plexiglass at reception desks or between certain offices if someone doesn't have their own office, one-way corridors, minimize the amount of people and in-person meetings in conference rooms. So to the extent possible, continue with Zoom calls or, Microsoft Team calls. I would also limit visitors, really no in-person meetings with clients to the extent possible or customers. And then for employees also, having temperature checks, having employees fill out questionnaires about their symptoms that they currently have and their travel, where have they been recently and how have they traveled, whether it's been public transportation. And depending on the answers to those questions, the employer may want to have someone remain home for a 14-day self-quarantine. But most importantly, the employer needs to follow the Centers for Disease Control recommendations and protocol with respect to wearing masks, maintaining 6 feet, and other personal protective equipment.
So, and now you mentioned a lot of things, and I know, there's such a swirl in the marketplace around, I feel like my freedoms are being infringed upon, particularly when we talk about masks and things like that, and the temperature check. So legally, employers have the right to do those things like temperature checks and things like that. Like, how much can an employer do or not do? Yeah. And, sort of from a legal perspective.
Right. That's an important concept as well. So the employers have the right to take temperature checks of its employees. They have the right to require them to wear masks. The ADA and EEOC and OSHA have recently issued guidelines that provides the ability for employers to do that. Now, with respect to temperature checks, it's important that that information remains confidential in the individual employee's personnel file and should not be shared with an employee. So employers do have these rights and are protected by laws that prohibit them to do that.
So, well, okay, because it's confidential, how do we protect employees' confidentiality if I'm Bill and I show up today to work and then suddenly I'm gone for 14 days, doesn't that somewhat limit the confidentiality? Because can't the assumption be made that, Bill may have had a temperature and that's why we're not seeing him the next 14? So how do you delicately balance that whole process?
That is, a fine line and a gray area that is going to be difficult. If someone tests positive or is sent home for quarantine, that positive diagnosis, that information cannot be shared with other employees. The identification of that employee can't be shared without that person's consent. Now, obviously, if someone is sent home, people will make assumptions, but the employer should not specifically identify, the nature of the issue and what's gone on. Obviously, people will talk in the workplace. It's going to be difficult to prohibit that, but the identification of the employee should not be disclosed unless he or she consents to that.
So, and then if I consent as the employee, is it limited consent? Because let's say I'm public facing, but I consent perhaps to my teammates being aware of it. Do I also have the legal right to limit the amount of consent for the general public? Because we always hear about, for example, Amazon was in the news that, X number of employees tested positive. But how do we navigate even that conversation? How much is too much information?
Right. So employers and the person that's been affected can limit it. So for purposes of contact tracing, that's been a hot topic as well. So we can identify who else has been in close proximity to that employee within the office. And that's where the information really should stay, on the need to know basis in the specific premises of the office. There really is no need, to share that information publicly unless that person, made appearances at a certain event or something like that, where they would want to identify others that were in that area for contact tracing. But otherwise, if the person's in the office, it should be limited to the employees and staff of that office.
Okay. Now, and another, because I think one of the largest challenges as we do start reopening is being sensitive to the needs of our employees, but also being aware of the fact that, I want to make sure that folks aren't trying to take advantage of the system as well. So what are reasonable accommodations or what reasonable accommodations should be provided to those employees with qualified disabilities who may request reduced contact with others? For example, I may have a pre-existing condition. And so because of that, what are those accommodations that an employer needs to consider even in thinking about those types of scenarios? Right.
So, I touched on some of them before, but some accommodations can include isolating employees if there's enough offices, so even converting conference rooms to offices so that people that may be on an interior space working in a cubicle can now work in an office so that employees are isolated, putting up plexiglass, also alternating shifts. So having, certain employees work on X days of the week and then other ones on another day and making sure that they're not sharing the same desk and computer. So alternating shifts. Also, to the extent possible that employees can continue to work remotely to allow that individual to continue to do that for a period of time. You can certainly allow them to use leave if they feel uncomfortable about returning back to work. That would be any accrued unused leave that they already have. But there are, employees that are going to be concerned, and as long as an employer has, following the protocols of the CDC and wants the employees to return to work, the employer can require the employee to return to work.
Okay. Now, and in that unlikely case where an employee says, I'm afraid of COVID, I just cannot work. what kind of waivers may be considered, and what should employers do in those cases where someone says, I just can't, I can't.
Right. And that's a topic that I've been starting to get a lot of questions about, and undoubtedly there'll be a lot more of that. So if an employer has, re-entered the workforce, so they're opening operations and they're requiring their employees to come back to work and are following all the protocols and guidelines, an employee refuses, that employee could be terminated without much liability to the employer. They don't have much rights at that point. And by following the guidelines, really sets up a defense for the employer. So an employee may claim some sort of claim of negligence, but provided the employer is following the CDC guidelines to set up other accommodations, it's less likely that there will be liability on the employee side, on the employer side. Additionally, the waivers has become a big issue as well, whether it makes sense to have your employees prior to returning work sign a waiver. Now, those are problematic because they may not be enforceable. There's issues related to workers' compensation laws. You can't prospectively waive claims. An individual also can't waive claims for a spouse or their children if they get COVID at the workplace, so they can't waive the claims for their spouse or children. And then, there's OSHA guidelines, meaning employers have an obligation and duty to provide a safe working place. And if someone's going to be required to sign a waiver, that means they're coming into the workplace and assuming the risk as if it's a not safe place to begin with. And that would potentially violate OSHA standards. So those waivers, people are using them potentially as a deterrent, but they are problematic.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Barb, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the fortunate few who perhaps received some grants besides the PPP loan. If I were one of those businesses that was lucky enough to receive grants, how do I figure out what expenses to pay from which source? Which bucket does that money come out of?
Okay, very good question. And there are a number of businesses that have been fortunate to receive multiple awards. There are so many things out there for people to take advantage of back in the March, April, May timeframe, where the state, the counties, the various local jurisdictions, some of the other organizations, as well as the federal government, have lots of opportunities. So many companies were applying for anything that they believe they qualified for. So first and foremost is to ensure that you are following all the regulations and requirements of any particular grant. So some grants said that they could only be used for payroll. Some grants were only to be used for a certain specific type of program. So if it was an arts and humanities type of grant that you could only use for a certain kind of nonprofit type thing, you need to make sure you're reading all the fine print and all the specifications for each of those awards to ensure that you are not going to trip over any of those ramifications. So that's part one. Then secondly, once you've taken a close look at all of that, then look at the various types of expenses that can be used for each one. Generally, you are not allowed, I'm going to use the word double dipping, you can't use multiple sources of funds to pay for the same costs in general. So you need to make sure that you're kind of putting that puzzle together to capture the most costs that you can while still complying with each of the requirements. Then once you've looked at all of that, I would focus on PPP, and it's a little easier to do that now that we have the 24-week option for PPPs as opposed to the 8-week option. Back when there was only the 8-week option prior to the Flexibility Act being passed, many people were struggling with, how am I going to use this grant for payroll and this other grant for payroll, but I got to use my payroll for PPP in order to get it forgiven. So the Forgiveness Act has taken a lot of pressure off of people in terms of needing to figure out how to appropriately spend those funds. That being said, then you do want to ensure that you are aiming for the maximum forgiveness possible on the PPP. So focus on payroll costs there to at least meet that 60% threshold. Then if you need payroll costs for other grants, pocket it there. If you need more than 60% in order to ensure 100% forgiveness, then put more of those payroll costs towards the PPP. If you are someone who has very low rent or very low utilities, don't have the ability of being able to spend 40% of the funds on those other non-payroll costs. Ensure that you're getting all of that. The other thing to keep in mind, and I've gotten this question a lot from clients and from other meetings and sources, networking groups that I've been participating in, and there's a lot of confusion over the EIDL loan. Most people are calling it EIDL. For those who applied for an EIDL loan, they could get up to a $10,000 grant that was issued as part of that application process very early on. And for any company that got that EIDL grant as well as obtained a PPP loan, when you do your forgiveness application for PPP and the bank will approve it, it'll go to SBA. SBA will then automatically offset that forgiveness amount by the amount of that EIDL grant that you received. So while you've dotted all the I's and crossed all your T's to ensure 100% forgiveness of your PPP loan, if you had an EIDL grant, you are still going to end up having to pay back as part of the PPP loan the portion that is attributable to the EIDL grant. And if you think about it, it actually kind of makes sense because you've already gotten this, I'll call it free money from the EIDL grant. So you can't duplicate that out of the forgiveness within the PPP. So that's one thing that is going to come as a surprise, unfortunately, to some people as they have figured and counted on the 100% forgiveness. And then it's like, oh, no, I got to repay this $10,000 to the bank.
Right. Wow. So, Jared, last question goes to you because I thought I saw, I know M&T Bank has been a large provider of the PPP loan money. And so thank you all for your service in that capacity and just supporting the business community. But I thought I saw, so is there still money that's out there or is everything's gone?
Yeah, no, great question. So most traditional financial institutions like M&T, the application portal is closed. There are a couple third-party lenders out there. June 30th, the funding will cut off. And there are a couple third-party providers out there who still have an online portal. But in regards to most traditional financial institutions, funding has cut off. To go back to one of Barbara's questions, though, what do the timelines look like, though, once your forgiveness application is submitted? Banks have up to 60 days to review the forgiveness application. Once it's sent over to the SBA has up to 90 days. And it's important to note that after your loan is either forgiven or paid in full, you want to make sure that you retain all of your PPP related documents for at least 6 years. Oh, wow. So that's another thing to note.
Gotcha. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you all so much for your time. As Barbara said, today is June 26th. It is approximately 12:30. And so be mindful of the date and time in which you listen to this recording because things are constantly evolving and changing. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Andrew, for your time connecting with us all. And thank all of you for tuning in with us online. On behalf of the entire Small Business Network team, our partners and sponsors, we look forward to seeing you again. Be well.
Thank you.